The autumn wind carried whispers through the tobacco fields of Virginia in 1859, and with it the scent of burning wood that seemed to come from nowhere. Margaret walked with her distinctive limp through the plantation grounds, her left leg dragging slightly behind her right, a permanent reminder of the iron shackle that had broken her ankle years ago when she tried to run. The other slaves avoided her gaze, not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Fear of what she represented, fear of what she knew. Master Thornwood had purchased her at auction 3 months prior for nearly nothing. The auctioneer's voice still echoed in her memory, dripping with disdain as he presented her to the crowd gathered in Richmond's slave market. "Damaged goods, gentlemen. Can't work the fields proper, but she cooks well enough, I'm told." The bidding had been sparse, half-hearted. Thornwood had raised his hand only once, offering a sum so low it drew snickers from the other plantation owners. Margaret remembered the weight of their stares, the way they looked through her rather than at her, as if she were already a ghost. But Margaret saw things others didn't. She noticed patterns in the way the overseer, Samuel Whitmore, returned from the woods at dawn with mud on his boots and blood under his fingernails. She observed how certain slaves would vanish in the night, and by morning Whitmore would claim they'd run north, though no dogs were sent to track them, no advertisements placed in newspapers offering rewards. The other plantation owners would nod knowingly when Thornwood mentioned these disappearances over glasses of bourbon, their eyes gleaming with something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but wasn't quite concern either. The first disappearance Margaret witnessed personally was Isaiah, a young man of 20 whose only crime was learning to read from a traveling preacher who'd stopped at the plantation under false pretenses. She'd been in the kitchen house, grinding corn for the next day's meals, when she heard Isaiah's voice raised in argument with Whitmore near the tool shed. The overseer's words were sharp, accusing. "You think you're clever, boy? Think those marks on paper make you human?" The sound of a blow, flesh against flesh, then silence. Margaret had limped to the window, peering through the gap in the wooden shutters. She watched Whitmore drag Isaiah's unconscious body toward the tree line as the sun set, painting the sky the color of dried blood. Isaiah never returned. The next morning, Whitmore stood before the assembled slaves during morning roll call, his face expressionless as carved stone. Isaiah ran, probably froze to death in the mountains by now. Let that be a lesson about the price of freedom. But Margaret had seen the fresh dirt beneath Whitmore's fingernails, seen the way he couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes. She knew Isaiah hadn't run anywhere. He was still here, somewhere in the dark Virginia soil. The pattern continued. Sarah, who'd sung too loudly during work, her voice carrying songs of Canaan and crossing rivers. Thomas, who'd questioned why they couldn't keep the vegetables they grew. Ruth, whose only transgression was being too beautiful, drawing unwanted attention from Thornwood's eldest son. One by one, they disappeared into Whitmore's midnight excursions, and one by one, the official story remained the same. Runaways, ingrates who'd abandoned the generous care of Master Thornwood. Margaret kept her observations to herself, but she began to notice something else. A smell that grew stronger as autumn deepened, emanating from the old tobacco barn at the far edge of the property. The barn hadn't been used in years, its roof partially collapsed, its walls weathered grey. Slaves were forbidden from approaching it, and Whitmore kept the only key on a chain around his neck. But on certain nights, when the moon was dark and the air hung heavy with moisture, Margaret would see lamplight flickering through the barn's cracks, and she would hear sounds that made her blood run cold. Digging, the scrape of metal against stone, and sometimes, very faintly, what might have been weeping. She began to piece together a horrifying truth. The disappearances weren't random acts of violence born from rage or twisted desire. They were systematic, planned, part of something larger. She'd overheard fragments of conversations between Thornwood and visitors who came after dark, men in fine clothes who spoke in hushed tones about the problem of insurrection, and examples that must be made. One night, pressed against the wall of the main house while cleaning the windows, she'd heard Thornwood's voice, thick with bourbon and bitterness. "They're getting ideas, gentlemen. This abolitionist talk seeping down from the north like poison. We can't allow it to take root. Better to remove the infected branches before the whole tree sickens." Another voice, one she didn't recognize, responded with cold calculation. "The key is discretion. No public spectacles that might inflame sympathies. Simply make them vanish. Let fear do the rest of the work." The sound of glasses clinking in agreement had made Margaret's hands shake so violently she nearly dropped her cleaning rag. Winter came early that year, and with it an unexpected visitor. A man arrived at Thornwood's plantation, claiming to be a journalist from Boston, researching conditions on southern plantations for a series of articles. His name was Daniel Wright, and his eyes held an intensity that made Margaret instinctively distrust him. Thornwood welcomed him with southern hospitality, eager to demonstrate how well his slaves were treated, how the northern propaganda about cruelty was nothing but lies manufactured by troublemakers. Wright stayed in the guest quarters, a small cottage near the main house, and during the day he would walk the property with a notebook, writing observations, asking questions. The slaves were instructed to smile, to speak only of their gratitude, to demonstrate their contentment. But Margaret saw how Wright's gaze lingered on the abandoned tobacco barn, how his questions seemed designed to probe for inconsistencies. He wasn't what he claimed to be. On his third night at the plantation, Margaret was serving dinner in the main house when Wright asked, seemingly casually, about the slave population. "I count 37 souls working your land, Master Thornwood. Yet your purchase records show 43 acquisitions over the past 2 years. Might I inquire about the discrepancy?" The dining room fell silent. Thornwood's knife scraped against his plate, the sound unnaturally loud. Whitmore, seated at the far end of the table, went very still. "Runaways," Thornwood said finally, his voice tight. 6 slaves who proved ungrateful for their treatment here. Despite our Christian charity, they chose to flee north, most likely dead in the wilderness by now. Wright made a note in his journal, his expression unreadable. How unfortunate. And no attempts at recovery? No pursuit? Thornwood's jaw clenched. "We don't waste resources on those who reject our benevolence, Mr. Wright. Let them learn the harsh realities of their choices." That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay on her thin mattress in the slave quarters, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, thinking about Wright's questions and Thornwood's barely concealed rage. Something was about to break. She could feel it in the air, thick and oppressive as the humidity before a storm. Around midnight, she heard footsteps outside, saw lamplight moving through the darkness. Unable to resist, she rose and limped to the window. Whitmore was walking toward the tobacco barn, carrying a shovel over his shoulder. Behind him, being dragged by 2 field hands Margaret didn't recognize, was a figure that struggled weakly. As they passed closer to the quarters, the lamplight illuminated the prisoner's face. It was Daniel Wright, his mouth gagged, his eyes wide with terror. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. The journalist had discovered too much, asked too many questions. Now he would join the others in whatever horror lay hidden in that barn. She should have stayed silent, should have returned to her bed and pretended she'd seen nothing. But something in Wright's desperate eyes, something in the way he'd looked at the slaves, not as property but as people, made her act. Margaret slipped from the quarters, her limp more pronounced in her haste, and followed the group toward the barn at a safe distance. The autumn night was cold, her breath misting in the air, and dead leaves crunched beneath her feet despite her attempts at stealth. The barn door stood open, and lamplight spilled out into the darkness. Margaret crept closer, pressing herself against the weathered wood. Peering through a gap in the wall, what she saw made her stomach turn. The interior of the barn had been converted into something monstrous. The earth floor had been dug up, revealing a network of pits, some empty, some filled with what could only be human remains in various stages of decomposition. The missing slaves, all of them, Isaiah, Sarah, Thomas, Ruth, others whose names she didn't know. Their bodies lay in shallow graves, some still partially visible, bones gleaming white in the lamplight. But there was more. Against the far wall stood wooden tables covered with papers, ledgers filled with names and dates. Beside them, collections of personal items, jewelry and coins taken from the dead, sorted and catalogued like merchandise. This wasn't just murder. It was systematic disposal, a calculated erasure of human beings who dared to question, to hope, to imagine freedom. Thornwood and Whitmore had created a machine of terror, and Wright had stumbled into its gears. Whitmore's voice cut through Margaret's horror. "Dig another pit, deep this time. This one's got family up north who'll come asking questions eventually." The field hands obeyed, their faces blank with the resignation of men who'd long ago surrendered their capacity for shock. Wright thrashed against his bonds, muffled screams escaping around his gag. Whitmore watched dispassionately, cleaning dirt from beneath his fingernails with a knife. Margaret knew she had seconds to decide. She could flee, save herself, live with the knowledge that she'd witnessed Wright's murder and done nothing, or she could act, knowing it would likely mean her own death. The weight of all those bodies, all those silenced voices, pressed down on her. She thought of Isaiah's eagerness to learn, Sarah's beautiful songs, Ruth's quiet dignity. She thought of the chains that had broken her ankle, the auction block where she'd been sold like livestock, the years of swallowing rage and humiliation just to survive another day. Her decision was made before she fully realized it. Margaret limped away from the barn as quickly as her damaged leg would allow, moving through the shadows toward the main house. The kitchen was never locked, servants expected to rise before dawn to prepare breakfast. She entered silently, navigating by memory in the darkness, and found what she needed: lamp oil, matches, and the knowledge of how quickly old, dry wood could burn. The main house was a testament to Thornwood's wealth, built with profit squeezed from the labor of people he considered property. Its walls were decorated with expensive paintings, its floors covered with imported rugs, its rooms filled with mahogany furniture that had cost more than the lives of everyone who worked his land. Margaret moved through it like a ghost, splashing lamp oil across the parlor, the dining room, the study where Thornwood kept his ledgers documenting his human inventory. She thought about freedom as she worked, real freedom, not the false promise of running north only to be hunted, captured, returned to even worse horrors, freedom that came from burning away the structures that made slavery possible, from refusing to let terror win, from choosing action over survival. Her hands didn't shake as she struck the match. The flame caught instantly, racing along the trail of oil with hungry enthusiasm. Margaret didn't run. She walked, her limp carrying her with strange dignity toward the slave quarters. By the time she reached them, the main house was fully engulfed, flames leaping into the night sky, crackling and roaring with the sound of liberation. She began pounding on doors, shouting for everyone to wake, to get out. The slaves emerged confused, then horrified as they saw the fire. But Margaret kept shouting, her voice carrying across the grounds. "The barn! Whitmore's at the barn with the prisoner. Our people are buried there. All of them. This is our chance." For a moment, no one moved. Years of conditioning, of beatings for disobedience, of watching others disappear for less than rebellion, held them frozen. But then someone ran toward the barn. Then another, then more. A wave of movement that couldn't be stopped. Whitmore heard them coming and emerged from the barn, his face illuminated by the distant fire of the burning house. He saw the crowd of slaves approaching and reached for the pistol at his belt. But there were too many. They overwhelmed him, and in the chaos, Daniel Wright was freed from his bonds. The journalist, his throat raw from screaming, stumbled to the barn's entrance and saw what Margaret had seen. The pits, the bodies, the evidence of systematic murder. The fire from the main house spread to nearby structures, aided by the dry autumn air. The overseer's quarters caught next, then the tool shed, then the stables. Horses screamed and broke free, galloping into the night. Thornwood himself appeared from somewhere, his nightclothes singed, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. He screamed orders that no one obeyed, cursed the slaves who'd turned on him, threatened punishments that rang hollow as his world literally burned around him. Margaret stood at the center of the chaos, her damaged leg giving her a strange stability while others ran in panic. She watched the flames consume the plantation, watched years of wealth and power built on human suffering turn to ash and smoke. Wright approached her, his hands shaking, his eyes still wide with the horror of what he'd nearly experienced. "You saved my life," he said, his voice hoarse. "You destroyed everything to save a stranger." Margaret looked at him, and in her eyes was something Wright would never forget. Not hatred, not triumph, but a weary understanding of the price of resistance. "Not everything," she replied quietly. "Just the things that needed burning." The fire burned through the night, visible for miles. It drew neighbors, other plantation owners who arrived to find Thornwood's empire reduced to smoldering ruins and his slaves scattered into the darkness. Wright stayed, documenting everything, his journalist's instincts overcoming his trauma. He photographed the barn's interior before it too caught fire, capturing evidence of the murder pit. He interviewed slaves who'd stayed, collecting testimonies of disappearances, of the systematic terror Thornwood and Whitmore had employed. But Whitmore himself was gone. In the confusion of the fire and the uprising, he'd vanished into the woods. Some said he fled north, others that he'd been killed by the slaves and his body hidden. Margaret knew the truth was probably simpler and darker. Men like Whitmore, men who'd built careers on cruelty, didn't simply disappear. They found new places to practice their craft, new victims to terrorize. The system that had created him remained intact, despite one plantation's destruction. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, authorities arrived from Richmond. Marshals, investigators, plantation owners demanding answers and justice. They found Daniel Wright with his documentation, his photographs, his interviews. They found the barn with its terrible secrets, though the fire had destroyed much of the physical evidence. And they found Margaret, sitting calmly on a stone wall, her damaged leg stretched before her, watching the sunrise paint the sky shades of pink and gold. She was arrested, of course. No matter the evidence of Thornwood's crimes, no matter the testimonies of murder and systematic oppression, Margaret had destroyed property worth thousands of dollars. She'd incited rebellion. She'd disrupted the social order. In the eyes of Virginia law in 1859, these were unforgivable sins. She was taken to Richmond to await trial, her limp making the journey long and painful. But Wright's articles changed everything. Published in northern newspapers, they detailed the horror of the tobacco barn, the disappeared slaves, the calculated terror employed to prevent even thoughts of freedom. The story spread, was reprinted, discussed in abolitionist circles, debated in Congress. Margaret's name became known, transformed from that of a limping slave woman no one wanted into a symbol of resistance against an evil system. Her trial became a spectacle. Abolitionists flooded Richmond, demanding her release. Southern sympathizers called for her execution as an example to other slaves who might consider rebellion. The prosecution argued that regardless of Thornwood's crimes, Margaret had committed arson and incited violence, crimes punishable by death. The defense, led by lawyers sent from Boston, argued justifiable defense of herself and others against imminent murder. The jury deliberated for 3 days. In the end, They reached a compromise that satisfied no one, but reflected the complicated reality of the moment. Margaret was found guilty of arson, but with mitigating circumstances. Her sentence: sailed to a northern household willing to take responsibility for her, essentially a transfer of ownership that amounted to exile from Virginia. The household that purchased her was a wealthy abolitionist family in Philadelphia who'd followed her case and offered to take her in, not as a slave, but as a paid employee once she reached Pennsylvania. The transaction was legal fiction, a way to remove Margaret from the South without martyring her through execution. Thornwood, facing his own investigations, didn't protest. He'd lost everything in the fire anyway, and was more concerned with avoiding criminal charges related to the murders. Margaret left Virginia in chains, as the law required for a convicted slave being transported. But those chains were removed the moment she crossed into Pennsylvania. She arrived in Philadelphia on a cold December morning, her limp as pronounced as ever, but her bearing transformed. The family that had purchased her freedom, the Harrisons, welcomed her not as property, but as a person. They offered her a room in their home, employment as a housekeeper, and something she'd never truly had: choice. Wright continued to visit her, documenting her story, helping her write her memoir. The book, published 2 years later, became a bestseller in the North. The Limping Slave Woman, a testament to the cost of freedom, detailed not just her own experiences, but those of all the slaves who disappeared into Thornwood's tobacco barn. It named names, provided dates, gave voice to the silenced. It became required reading in abolitionist circles and fuel for the growing tensions between North and South. Whitmore was never found, though reports of an overseer matching his description surfaced occasionally from plantations in Georgia and Mississippi. Each time, slaves would begin to disappear in the same pattern, the same systematic erasure. Wright tried to investigate, but by the time he arrived, Whitmore would be gone again, a ghost of terror moving through the South's slave infrastructure. Margaret lived in Philadelphia for 3 more years before the war came. When it did, when the Union needed intelligence about Southern plantations, about the geography and habits of those who'd profited from slavery, she volunteered. Her limp kept her from serving as a soldier, but her knowledge, her experience, her understanding of how the system worked made her invaluable. She guided escaped slaves north, provided information to Union generals, and worked tirelessly to ensure that the system that had broken her ankle and murdered her friends would be destroyed root and branch. She never returned to Virginia during the war, but after it ended, after the Confederacy fell and slavery was abolished, she made one final journey. The Thornwood plantation was a ruin, its fields overgrown, its burned buildings never rebuilt. The tobacco barn, that chamber of horrors, had collapsed entirely. But Margaret came with workers, with shovels, with the determination to give dignity to those who'd been denied it in life. They excavated the barn's site carefully, reverently. They found the remains of 23 individuals, buried in shallow graves, some still bearing the marks of violence. Margaret identified them when she could, spoke their names aloud for the first time in years: Isaiah, Sarah, Thomas, Ruth, others whose names she'd learned from fellow slaves. Each one was given a proper burial in a cemetery for freedmen, their graves marked with headstones that stated their names and a simple inscription: they sought freedom. They found it. The memorial became a pilgrimage site for former slaves, for abolitionists, for anyone who wanted to remember the cost of the fight against slavery. Margaret attended every dedication ceremony, her limp more pronounced with age, but her voice strong as she spoke about the disappeared, about the price of resistance, about the necessity of remembering history's darkest chapters so they couldn't be repeated. She lived to be 67, dying in 1889 in the Philadelphia home that had first given her freedom. Her funeral was attended by hundreds, including former slaves who'd found their own freedom through the Underground Railroad, by abolitionists who'd fought alongside her, and by Daniel Wright, now an old man himself, who'd never stopped writing about the tobacco barn and what it represented. He gave the eulogy, his voice breaking as he spoke about the night Margaret had saved his life by destroying a plantation. "She limped through this world," Wright said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "But she walked taller than any of us. She saw evil and didn't turn away. She faced the choice between survival and chose justice, knowing it would cost her everything. The fire she lit that night burned away more than buildings. It burned away the illusion that slavery could ever be benevolent, that terror could ever be justified, that freedom could be granted rather than taken." Margaret was buried in a cemetery overlooking Philadelphia, her grave marked with a headstone that bore no mention of slavery, no reference to her legal status or her limp. Just her name, her dates, and an inscription she'd chosen herself. She reached the fire before it spread, and in burning away chains, she illuminated the path to freedom for those who followed. The story of the tobacco barn, of the disappeared slaves, of Margaret's choice to act rather than survive, became part of the larger narrative of slavery's end and Reconstruction's beginning. Historians debated the details, the exact number of victims, the extent of the conspiracy. But no one disputed the central truth, that systematic terror had been employed to maintain slavery, that countless souls had been erased from history, and that one woman's act of desperate courage had helped expose that truth. Years later, researchers examining records from the antebellum South found disturbing patterns that suggested Thornwood's operation wasn't unique. Other plantations showed similar discrepancies between purchase records and actual slave populations. Other abandoned structures, when excavated, revealed similar horrors. The tobacco barn had been one node in a larger network of terror, a system designed to eliminate those who questioned, who resisted, who dared to imagine freedom. But Margaret's story also revealed something else. That resistance had always existed, that even in the darkest circumstances, people had chosen to fight rather than accept subjugation. Every slave who'd tried to run, who'd learned to read despite the prohibition, who'd sung songs of freedom, who'd passed along information about the Underground Railroad, had been part of that resistance. Margaret's fire had been dramatic, had made headlines, had changed the course of her own life and many others. But it was part of a larger fire that had burned throughout slavery's existence. Small acts of defiance that accumulated into a force that the system couldn't ultimately contain. The limping slave woman whom no one wanted had become more valuable than all of Thornwood's wealth because she'd possessed something he never could: the courage to act according to conscience rather than self-preservation. She'd reached the fire before it spread, and in doing so, had helped ensure that the fire of freedom would eventually consume the entire rotten system of slavery itself. Her legacy lived on not in monuments or museums, though those came later, but in the fundamental truth she demonstrated, that freedom isn't given, it's taken, and that the price of taking it is always high but always worth paying.